I suspect what I'm going to say is actually putting forward the view that the legal profession can't do anything. Anyway, thank you, Carol. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having the meeting easy to find in a building that says Peirce and Sons on a street that's called Peirce Street. Thank you for that. We're going to consider the question of whether the world that we inhabit is capable of accepting or acting upon that bravest of our species, an individual, usually an individual, who will blow the whistle on, for the most part, what we're considering is state criminality. And so I'd like to consider if there are such heroic occurrences, whether they in fact impact upon a world capable of reacting to verifiable, authentic data that was always intended to remain the province, the possession of a very select, secret few. And so what we're asking is, and we're going on the basis that what the whistleblower says is the truth, and the truth was designed to be not known, whether we're capable of receiving the truth and acting upon it when we receive it. If we look back on the last more than a decade, the last 13 years, we're looking at recent history in which the enormity of state actions have been difficult to comprehend and difficult to accommodate in our mindset. But yet, we have had considerable ability to know without whistleblowers, but including whistleblowers. And so the most profound question is really, what have we done once we've known? And why has it taken the few to blow a whistle when it's all there really anyway? So a good place to begin, I think, I commend to your attention to read. You won't want to buy it, you certainly won't want to read it, but I commend Tony Blair's memoirs. They're extraordinarily instructive, and it's all there to be seen. And so you have circumstances now, right almost in real time, when memoirs are being written by individuals who are vainglorious, arrogant, powerful, and want to record while they still have all the secret cabinet minutes to hand and their diaries, want to record what they thought and did. So Tony Blair opens up to us and tells us that as soon as he was told that the planes had gone into the Twin Towers on 9/11, he said, I saw it all. I could see the colours very clearly, that I had never seen so clearly before, all joined up, the splashes of colour joined up, and I understood completely that this was the enemy. And then he identifies all of those countries in the Arab world where there were dictatorships, where there were oppressive regimes, where the only active or below active opposition tended to be Islamic in its basis. Tony Blair said, I saw it all. Libya, Tunisia, Lebanon, Palestine. This was the enemy that we had to fight. And he said it was like a kaleidoscope. The pieces were in the air, and before they fell down, before they fell to the earth, I saw that we should reorder the world. Now, you don't need a whistleblower, in fact, if you have that in writing, to see the level of derangement, the level of arrogance, but also to understand this was the power, and that set the narrative for everything that happened after and is happening now. That set the narrative of today's millions being massacred in Syria as it happens. That set the narrative. And from then on, the question of what can lawyers do, what can knowledge of human rights, what can knowledge of international treaty obligations do, is extremely challenging and very difficult to actually swallow. Because for all the battles, in fact, that arrogance and that narrative in our country right now is what is writ large and what persists. What he said about his actions when he brought in internment, for instance, immediately, and then 3.5 years later the House of Lords overturned it, saying it was unlawful. What he said was, well, this was just a disagreement between me and the judiciary. He said it was grossly stupid, their judgment, saying it was unlawful. And what it came down to was a disagreement between me and the judiciary as to the level of threat we faced. So, if you have that circumstance of someone saying at the time, as well as reminiscing later, we don't need to wait 100 years to find out the origins of World War I now. We can look at the time our politicians speak and quickly after they write their memoirs. We can see the convergence, not just in one man's mind, but the convergence that became our foreign policy and still persists, that you equate every liberation struggle with Al-Qaeda. You declare that to be the enemy, and you collate, converge, conjoin a whole geographical, unrelated list of different political, religious liberation struggles in one, and declare them with the enemy. And so throughout, we've been on the wrong side of history. Throughout, on the wrong side of history. Now within that circumstance, where really it was all there to be seen, there have been heroic individuals who've stood up, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes deliberately, to be counted, and they've been victims. And Michael referred to, I don't know, I'm interested to know more about revelations about what's happened in police stations and what's happened to whistleblowers. Perhaps they have fallen foul of the traditional accolade given to whistleblowers, which is to punish them, to attempt to destroy them, to destroy their reputations, to destroy their health, to destroy their careers. Perhaps they've met that kind of fate, I don't know. But in this whole mix of perception, we first invaded Afghanistan. Whatever the justification, Blair's memoirs, read in parallel with Alistair Cook's memoirs, read in parallel with Peter Mandelson's memoirs, tell us that the sound advice was Al-Qaeda is actually not welcomed by the Taliban. If you're going after the Taliban, it's really just a load of sand. There are very few targets. Nevertheless, we chose to invade with the most powerful, richest country in the world, chose to invade the poorest post-conflict society in the world. And when it came next to Iraq, the wish to invade Iraq, which had been held up when Bush said, or listened to, or the advice was, you can't really invade Iraq until you've invaded Afghanistan first. It just doesn't seem right as a reaction to Al-Qaeda bombing the Twin Towers. But when it came to Iraq, Dr. David Kelly, who had said, there aren't any weapons of mass destruction, there aren't any. What happened to him? He was destroyed, and he died, and he was deliberately destroyed. And so, as we've moved on through the horrible mess of the years since then, there have been revelations, some utterly inadvertent, found on the phone of US military, Abu Ghraib, accidental, pictures for their own amusement and use, but there's nothing like a picture to blow the whistle. And then some much more deliberate, but you have circumstances where everything is meant to be impenetrable, even if it's a war, a very open affair. The way in which journalists have been required to report the war, with a few honourable exceptions, has been to be embedded with troops. Very, very difficult indeed to be able to give a truly objective, sustained account without risking being dislodged from your embedded position. From then on, at every level, the battle has been by governments to prevent the explosions of anger and revelation that accidental or deliberate whistleblowing achieve, to suppress it. And I don't know about Ireland, I don't know. But in England, in Britain, there's been a passive acceptance of the narrative that gets given. An endless passive acceptance and unquestioning of the narrative that gets told. Now how, if we're discussing whistleblowing, how do we discuss the achievements of those occasional brave individuals who know that they have something to say that will transform the whole understanding that society has? What are they meant to think? Either knowing that the fate of a whistleblower is to be destroyed. So if you get over in your mind the appreciation that what you may be risking your life and your family and your liberty and your livelihood to achieve may fall on ears that are so deliberately deafened that it will be of no use, that becomes a further censoring mechanism. And it's that second failure to recognise and act upon what we know that is the most troubling and the most challenging and the most demanding for us, the potential recipients of those brave revelations. Now, 13 years on, the high crimes and misdemeanours of government and of ministers go completely unpunished. There hasn't been a single head that's rolled, whatever the gravity of what has come to be known. Amongst the most powerful and the most interesting, in the sense not just a story for one day that needs to be put aside with the next day's news, however frivolous. Amongst the most powerful were the revelations about Guantanamo, what happened in Guantanamo. And for us in the UK, maybe the opportunity, whether we airbrushed out, whitewashed out every comprehension of it, there should have come a moment of truth when those men who had come back, those British citizens and British residents who had come back from Guantanamo and told the tale of what had happened and insisted that throughout there have been British agents there, throughout, and all the time the crocodile tears of Blair, Brown, Jack Straw, Harriet Harman have been, we deplore Guantanamo, we deplore. We tell the Americans, but they won't listen to us, and the men come back and say, but they were there, they were there. They were there in the torture chambers, they were watching, they saw it all, they knew it all. And those men sued the government, and the government, after 3 years of prevaricating and grudging disclosure of government documents, chose to negotiate and settle those claims. I wonder why. But in the meantime, those grudging revelations had included disclosure of cabinet minutes in early 2002, where the first British citizens were being airlifted in chains, blindfolded, gagged, like men on slave ships hundreds of years ago, transported across the Atlantic to torture. At the very time the government, the ministers, their memoranda, the cabinet minutes were saying the longer they stay there the better. It suits our policy best to have them go and not come back. And yet sitting down at a table, Foreign Office officials with those men's relatives, saying we know nothing. We know nothing. We can't do anything. The Americans won't let us. That's one shocking piece of knowledge that somehow we've accommodated. All right, we didn't know it all then. All right, it seemed as if it was very hard to stop the war, and 1 million people had marched and they didn't stop it, so what could one do? Maybe. But then, somewhat later, comes visual footage. Chelsea Manning, as she was then known, Bradley Manning, blew the whistle in a hugely significant way on US actions. But interestingly, part of the WikiLeaks exposés involved not just the shock horror of helicopter pilots gunning down civilians in Iran, not just that hideous image. Something slightly more nuanced, which had effect. And that was the disclosure of a huge number of report backs by US ambassadors all over the world on what was happening on the ground. And unlike the public stance, this is our ally, Gaddafi, Mubarak, Assad. This is someone who is helping us in the war on terror, war against Al-Qaeda. Instead of that, there was a more nuanced comprehension that said the regime in Tunisia is disgraceful, it's corrupt, it's oppressive, it's brutalising its people. Now that is regarded by the Tunisians as a critical spark that ignited the first country that began what we call the Arab Spring. So there was a truth there of comprehension which assisted a movement, a revolution, in realising that there was a degree of comprehension, a degree of alliances, and then one country after another ignited in the same swathe of belief that it could happen. There was an accommodation of a revelation that helped fuel a fire that was, for a while, inspirational. And then, in the Libyan revolution, again of interest to us in England, not just were the Libyan people liberated, but the intelligence offices, British Embassy's offices, the prisons offices in Tripoli, and the wealth of documentation there to be found set it all out. We were sending telegrams to arrange the rendition of Libyans, arrange it with America. This is where these refugees are. These were dissidents who had fled Gaddafi, who had been the one opposition to Gaddafi's brutality, who had fled years before. We sent telegrams saying they're in Hong Kong right now, they're on their way to England on a direct flight to seek asylum. They're stopping off at Bangkok. You've got to arrange transport. And so Belhaj and then al-Sadi, leaders of the Libyan Islamic Liberation Front, were subjected, thanks to us, to rendition and torture, and their wives to rendition and torture. And all of this there to be found in the offices in Tripoli. And not just those two. Years of a relationship between our security service and the Libyan security service. Years of relationship. PowerPoint presentations by our security services in Libya. Create hostile environment. This is for the relatives of people in England. This is not the torture chambers in Libya. This is how to pressure relatives in England to put pressure on relatives in Libya. It's beyond disgusting. It's beyond disgraceful. It's criminality of the worst kind. Individual criminality by the heads of the security services, individual criminality by the Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, who signed off on it. But no heads have rolled. And what have we done in response? What have we done? This is why one has to worry about the concept of the law somehow saving us, where we're in a world which has gone so particularly crazy. Are you saying a few minutes more? No,
yep. Yes, a few more. Yeah. Okay.
I could hear it's as appalling a vista as one could contemplate this. But our response has been to say we have to have a secret court. If it's the intelligence services being sued, it can only happen if the litigator, the claimant, doesn't know the evidence, won't know the basis of the finding. And in the case of Belhaj, a judge has already said, you can't continue with your action against the British government because it would disturb our relationship with the United States. That's the objective. That's the objective. Indeed, one would think the United States citizens will be disturbed at their relationship with us. So the last and perhaps most enormous revelation in terms of size and implications is Edward Snowden. We're all being spied upon. All your country, all my country, everybody's country, everybody's children, everybody's private life, everything we learn. And yet we're not revolting, so to speak. Maybe some countries have reacted. We, of course, have GCHQ contributing every minute, no doubt, for a considerable price, more actively, more illegally, in fact, than the American covert institutions are doing. But the intention is, Snowden, of course, has had to flee, but the partner of a Guardian journalist who was merely passing through Heathrow and might have been conveying information of state criminality was held and questioned under the Terrorism Act and challenged it in the courts to say, excuse me, this is not terrorism, you can't equate this with terrorism, and the courts held that it is. It could affect national security. Could be something there affects national security. That's not what the concept of terrorism was meant to comprise. It simply was not. But it's a message. A message, what happened to Manning, what happened to Miranda, what would happen to Snowden. The message is, you have no future if you do this. And yet what Snowden has revealed is so enormous, so enormous. It should concern the whole world. It's very difficult for societies to come to grips with wrongdoing. Very hard for societies to do what's difficult, to hold up a mirror to their faces and see what they really are. But we are given, have been given, every opportunity. And now we're with Syria. The worst human crisis of this century, probably the worst since World War II, with millions being slaughtered, starved, displaced, dying at the hands of an appalling dictator. And yet we in our country have taken the narrative lock, stock and barrel that Tony Blair began in 9/11, on the day 9/11. We've taken that narrative lock, stock and barrel. And so in the press now and the government utterances, you will hear one thing when you hear Syria: Islamists, Al-Qaeda, blowback. Men will go out there and try to defend Syrian people and come back to our country, and God help us all. We're gone. It's an emergency. It's terrorism. Lock up everybody who might fight in Syria, lock up convoys, stop them under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act at airports, frighten them off, doing what's our moral responsibility as human beings to do, which is to save the Syrian people. That's where we've got to. And so we've had every possible whistle blown. And if we don't hear the whistle and we don't act on it, then the bravery of whistleblowers is worse than just ignoring. It's an utter betrayal.